What's up, woodworkers? My name is Corbin Dunn, and today I'm going to walk through building the river box I designed. I also sometimes call it a waterfall box because the epoxy flows from the top and down the sides like a waterfall. I've made 4 or 5 boxes in this particular style. It's quite simple to make with a lot of basic woodworking tools. Follow along as I build the box with spalted oak wood, alder, and ghost epoxy that shimmers purple in the light. The box is roughly 12 inches long, 7.5 inches deep, and 4 inches tall. These proportions follow the golden ratio and are generally pleasing to the eye. All the wood pieces are planed to 1/2 inch thick, and it will have a 1/8 inch thick piece of plywood for the bottom. The first step is to make the mold. It will have about these dimensions that I show here, but the only thing that needs to be accurately cut is the bottom piece, and even that isn't too important because I add in some padding to allow for cleanup. I make the mold out of 3/4 inch plywood or melamine. It's really just whatever scraps of plywood I have laying around. I also tend to reuse mold pieces a lot. The epoxy will stick to wood or melamine, and I generally use cheap packing tape to make it not stick, but sometimes this tape has trouble sticking to plywood. The red tape seen here is tuck tape, or another brand from Home Depot is known as Tyvek tape. It sticks better, but it's more expensive. I apply the tape before sealing the edges and put the tape over the edge. This makes it a little easier to demold. I seal the edges with silicone sealant. I don't use acrylic-based sealant because it won't work as well. I like to use black because it's easier for me to see against a white background. Melamine tends to crack if you don't pre-drill pilot holes in the wood. I'm using 1¼ inch generic wood screws to hold it together. Wood selection for the top is really important. I want 2 pieces that go well together and aren't too large or small for the size of the river. I'm using some California black oak that I harvested from my property. The tree fell down in a storm a few years back, and I cut it up with an Alaskan mill. I planed the pieces to a bit over 1/2 inch thick. I'll take it down to the final thickness after the epoxy has cured. I like to cut up odd pieces on my table saw sled. I use T-track clamps to hold the pieces steady. An alternative would be to use a track saw to make these cuts, or a bandsaw. The edges of the wood need to be cleaned up in order to ensure the epoxy will grip to them and not fall apart. I use a wire brush on my drill to accomplish this task, and then a little touch of hand sanding. The next step is to seal the wood. I generally like to use a quick drying epoxy, and I prefer to use Quickset from Wisebond. The epoxy needs to be applied to the live edge to prevent air bubbles, but I also seal the bottom with it. I can then clamp the wood into the mold, and the epoxy will temporarily glue it down. After about 1 hour to 1.5 hours, the sealing epoxy will be firm but still tacky. This is the sweet time period for doing the next pour. If I wait longer and it fully cures, I will need to do some sanding to rough up the epoxy so the next pour of it will stick to it. Even though it is tacky here, I can still remove the clamps and begin doing the pour. I'm pouring at a touch over 1/2 inch thick. This is too deep for tabletop epoxies, which usually have a max depth of about 1/4 inch. It's also a little too shallow for deep pour epoxies. However, they will work fine, but just cure a lot slower. I found a good middle ground is KS Resin's deep pour epoxy. I don't really consider it a deep pour epoxy as it sets up way too quickly and has poor bubble release, but it works quite well on these shallower pours. I intentionally over poured the river. I wanted to fill in a lot of the small imperfections in the wood. My 20-inch planer has a spiral cutter head, and I have found that spiral cutters tend to leave more chip out than regular straight blade planers. So I fall back to my 12-inch Makita benchtop planer and take some small passes to avoid chip out. I rip the width to the size I need and set my saw for cutting 45s. Once the top is cut, I prepare the stock for the sides. I use alder a lot because it complements the tones in the oak but doesn't overpower anything. The size of the pieces is about 3/16 of an inch longer on the top and the sides in order to fit in some grooves. The next step is to cut dados for those grooves in the river pieces. I drop in a 1/2 inch dado set and bump it over slightly after one pass until the fit is just perfect and not too tight. I like to have the sides inset by about 1/8 inch to provide a little bit of relief. The bottom is cut from 1/8 inch alder plywood. Just as the other pieces, I size it to be 3/16 of an inch larger on each side to fit into some grooves. Then I groove the sides for that plywood bottom piece. It's just 2 passes on an 1/8 inch kerf blade. The only tricky part is that I have to do some stop grooves for the sides. I carefully drop the piece down and stop it before it cuts through. This does call for a little hand chisel cleanup. I do some dry test fitting to make sure everything works okay and aligns alright. After that, I fill up any imperfections with some quick setting epoxy. Before I do the glue up, I sand all the pieces, which would be difficult to sand after it's all in one piece. Basically that means the inside and the sides. I sand wood to 220 and epoxy up to 1000 grit. Epoxy doesn't glue well with wood glue, so I use quick setting epoxy to glue the 45s and regular wood glue for the other parts. I had heated the epoxy a bit too much in this case and it started setting up a little bit too quickly. Normally I get about 10 to 15 minutes to manipulate things, but it was setting up, so I grabbed my clamps and used them to assist in keeping things straight. Normally I can just use packing tape to hold things together and the epoxy won't stick to the packing tape. After the box is dried, I sand the outside to 220 grit. The lid is cut off with a bandsaw, but I've also used the table saw to cut off lids on prior boxes. When I use the table saw, I don't cut all the way through to ensure it doesn't collapse. I then finish the cut with a handsaw or utility knife. Hinge holes are cut in the top and the bottom. I've tried various techniques for aligning hinges, but I seem to have the best luck with just centering them by eye and punching the center with my X-Acto blade. This helps the drill bit not wander when drilling a pilot hole. The final outside is sanded to the same as the inside, 220 for the wood and 1000 grit for the epoxy parts. And then finish with 2 coats of Osmo Poly-X. Thanks everyone. Feel free to ask me questions and try to make this box yourself.